Today we'll be trying to find out which turret is better on your Repulsor Executioner. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're running the numbers on the Heavy Laser Destroyer and the Macroplasma Incinerator, the two main turret options on the very scary Repulsor Executioner. We'll take a look at their damage profile versus various targets and have a think about a few of the other factors that might influence you one way or the other with these guys. So without further ado, let's see how they compare against typical targets. So this table shows a breakdown of the Heavy Laser Destroyer versus the Macroplasma Incinerator. One round of shooting versus a bunch of typical targets. We'll focus on the top two lines of the table to start with. First up, the Heavy Laser Destroyer is a 72-inch Heavy 2 weapon with Strength 10, AP-4 and Damage D6. Because of the Repulsor Executioner's special rule for moving less than half its maximum move distance, meaning that it can fire twice, it means that it's essentially a Heavy 4 weapon in most normal circumstances. In addition to this, the Heavy Laser Destroyer counts any damage rolls that are less than 3 as 3, slightly raising its average damage output to an average of 4 per shot and making it very good against 3-wound infantry. We're going to be assuming we're overcharging the Macroplasma Incinerator, as in general this is going to be the only real way it's going to compete with the Heavy Laser Destroyer, although some situations you won't need to, such as against these tactical marines in this table. In its overcharged profile, assuming that we're moving less than half our maximum move, it's 2d6, 36-inch range, Strength 9, AP-4 and Damage 2. As the AP of both of these weapons is so high against all of these targets, it doesn't actually matter whether they're in Devastator Doctrine or not, as going from AP4 to AP-5 is only going to matter if your opponent has a 2-up save and no invul. So if we look at the actual damage output, the Macroplasma Incinerator handily wins when we're shooting at Tactical Marines or Primaris Intercessors, killing around about 4 of each of these, compared with a Heavy Laser Destroyer typically only killing around 2 of them. More shots just means it's generally going to be better against the vast majority of infantry targets, although admittedly you'd rarely be wanting to shoot a Heavy Laser Destroyer at basic troops. It really needs to be targeting armour for it to be efficient, but versatility is certainly a positive thing, and the Macroplasma is very efficient in chewing through Primaris Intercessors in particular. If we move on to look at some Space Marine aggressors, then the balance actually flips back in the Heavy Laser Destroyer's favour. This is because it'll still wound on 2s despite toughness 5, where the Macroplasma wounds on 3s. Also being flat damage 2 means that some damage is wasted against the aggressors, where the Heavy Laser Destroyer's special rule, meaning that it wounds on 3s at worst, means that it's very efficient against aggressors and just puts it over the edge, as to always take 1 shot from the Heavy Laser Destroyer to go through an aggressor and 2 shots for the Macroplasma Incinerator. I didn't include the numbers on this chart, but if you're interested in their damage output against Centurions, which is a bit of a relevant question in today's meta, then they're almost both exactly equal. The Macroplasma very slightly wins out, but not to the extent where you'd really notice the difference. They both kill about 1.5 Centurions per turn on average. If we look at heavier armoured targets now, it's a win for the Heavy Laser Destroyer, but not a particularly big win to be honest. An average of 7 wounds versus 6 against the standard vehicle profile, and an average of 4.7 versus just over 4 for when you're targeting Imperial Knights. So in general, from the basic maths, the Heavy Laser Destroyer will put more wounds on vehicles and 3-wound infantry, and the Macroplasma Incinerator will be better against any lighter infantry that have 2 wounds or less. Now towards the bottom of the table, I've included the numbers for a couple of special scenarios, namely the Imperial Fist's boosted Devastator Doctrine where they get extra damage against vehicles, which will be the same as deploying Weapons of the Dark Age for the Dark Angels on the Macroplasma Incinerator. Neither of these change anything against Tactical Marines or Intercessors, but if you use Weapons of the Dark Age on the Macroplasma against aggressors, then it gets incredibly efficient indeed, as you're offing an aggressor every single time you get a wound through, meaning on average that you're killing 3 of them even if you have no other buffs or rerolls. Sadly, Imperial Fists won't get any benefit here because of course aggressors are not vehicles. If we do turn our attention to vehicles though, then if you assumed either Weapons of the Dark Age or the Imperial Fist Super Doctrine, then the Macroplasma Incinerator does get slightly better than the Heavy Laser Destroyer, even if the Heavy Laser Destroyer also gets the Imperial Fist Doctrine bonus. In Imperial Fist the numbers are pretty much even, though it does mean that the Macroplasma Incinerator is essentially better against all targets, aside from 3-wound infantry such as aggressors. And in Dark Angels, if you're happy to spend a command point on Weapons of the Dark Age, then the Macroplasma will handily outperform the Heavy Laser Destroyer in all areas. Naturally this will cost you a command point per turn though. So if we look at the other factors aside from the raw numbers, there are a few other important factors to consider. The main advantage that the heavy laser destroyer has is that it has incredibly long range. 72-inch range means that it will be threatening whatever it wants to on the entire table, provided it has line of sight to it of course, where the Macroplasma Incinerator's 36-inch range is really quite limiting. I'm sure you'll be able to get to some important targets, but the things that you really want to shoot might be out of range, so that is a big factor. Secondly, you have to bear in mind the cost of overcharging the Macroplasma Incinerator. Even if you do have a source of reroll ones, you are likely to take a few mortal wounds over the course of a game's worth of shooting, and this will get heavily compounded whenever you target something that has a negative to hit modifier, such as flyers for example. It is possible to somewhat counter this with reroll ones from a captain or a chapter master, and things that give +1 to hit auras, such as a tech marine with the Master of Machines warlord trait or chaplain listeners, but the chance to deal damage to yourself isn't the best to be honest, so that's another advantage of the heavy laser destroyer. Finally, in the heavy laser destroyer's favour, having fewer shots means that it's a lot more powerful to use rerolls for, whether that's rerolls for Master Artisans, where you get to reroll 1 failed hit and wound per turn, a command point reroll to maybe try and get 1 more wound through when it really matters, or other things like the Iron Hands Targeting Protocol's Warlord trait, which again can give you a hit and wound reroll per turn. As it has fewer more higher power shots, then the rerolls just have a little bit more value. So if you're playing Salamanders or something, then that's another point in the heavy laser destroyer's favour. Finally, if you're considering the looks of the heavy laser destroyer, I personally think it makes the Repulsor look a lot better and a lot more well balanced as a tank compared with the standard one, which just seems to have minor guns on it all over the place. But I admit that that's completely subjective. In the Macroplasma's favour, we've already mentioned that it's far better at clearing out heavy infantry, so if you need more of that kind of firepower than dedicated anti-tank, then it could be the way to go. It's worth noting that it's very slightly cheaper in terms of points cost compared with the heavy laser destroyer. A Repulsor with the Macroplasma Incinerator will cost you 9 points less than the heavy laser destroyer armed one, and this will be a lot more of a factor on a lot of other units, but because you're already paying over 300 points for the Repulsor Executioner, percentage-wise over the cost of the initial unit, it's actually really not that big a factor as it makes up less than 3% of the model's total points cost as to which gun that you choose. It is a small extra factor in the favour of the Macroplasma, but honestly I would just choose the gun that you actually would need in your army, rather than trying to scrimp and save 9 points and potentially hamper a very points expensive model. So in general I'd make the decision based on the type of firepower that you need rather than this small point saving. And finally, as we've said, the Macroplasma Incinerator gets a lot more benefits from the Imperial Fist doctrine compared with the heavy laser destroyer, due to damage 2 going to damage 3 being a much bigger jump than an average damage 4 going to an average damage 5, and also it's a lot more viable in Dark Angels, both because of the Weapons of the Dark Age stratagem, which again makes that big jump from damage 2 to damage 3, but also because of their new unique Devastator doctrine giving them extra range on all the heavy weapons, which somewhat addresses the Macroplasma Incinerator's other main weakness. So overall I think that the two guns are relatively well balanced. It depends on whether you want shorter ranged, more generalist firepower that can both threaten heavy infantry and armour, or extreme long ranged, dedicated anti-tank firepower in the heavy laser destroyer. In a general take-all-comers match, I slightly prefer the heavy laser destroyer myself, though really the deciding factor would be the type of list that I built, what gaps needed to be covered, and which chapter or army I'd be running it in. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below, and if you're favouring one of these guns over the other to any great extent. I think Games Workshop in general has done quite a good job of balancing them, so it's good to see that one just doesn't massively outshine the other in all circumstances. If you've enjoyed this video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we have new 40k content coming out every single day. And if you'd like to support the channel, then any support on Patreon is greatly appreciated, as it's what keeps the channel going and allows me to focus on this a lot more rather than my regular job. There's a link in the description below if you're interested. Thanks again for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.